I always thought stories about haunted places were just urban legends, the kind of thing towns like Salem used to draw tourists, cheap thrills and ghost tours for the gullible. But what happened to me last October wasn't part of any tourist attraction. I came face to face with something ancient and malevolent, and I can't unsee it. It all started when I decided to take a detour on my way back to Boston. The GPS suggested a shortcut through Salem's old deserted streets. The fog rolled in thick as soup, and the air grew unnaturally cold. When I saw the dilapidated stone church, I couldn't resist stopping to take a closer look. The decision haunts me to this day. What started as a harmless detour through Salem quickly spiraled into the most horrifying experience of my life. A crumbling stone church, hidden behind thick fog, drew me in with its eerie silence. The deeper I ventured, the more I realized something was deeply wrong. Whispers echoed in the air, shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, and a sense of dread weighed heavy on me. By the time I understood what I had stumbled into, it was already too late. I wasn't even supposed to be in Salem that day. My original plan was to drive straight back to Boston after a weekend hiking in New Hampshire. But an accident on the interstate turned a 3-hour drive into a 6-hour nightmare. Frustrated and exhausted, I let my GPS reroute me through the back roads, promising a quicker way home. The shortcut wound through small New England towns, their charm amplified by the autumn foliage. Salem was the last place I expected to pass through. It wasn't even marked on my GPS. But as I turned onto a narrow cobblestone street, a sign came into view. "Welcome to Salem, Witch City." I laughed to myself. Of course Salem. It was almost cliché. Fog started to roll in as the sun dipped below the horizon. The charming colonial houses and tidy storefronts disappeared behind the dense grey mist. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their glow barely penetrating the thick air. My phone lost service and my GPS froze. I was left with nothing but the winding road ahead and an uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. That's when I saw it. A crumbling stone church, half hidden behind skeletal trees. The building was ancient, its once proud spire now leaning precariously. A wrought iron fence surrounded the grounds, its gate hanging open like a silent invitation. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. As I stepped out of my car, the world fell eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just the sound of my own breathing. The church's facade was covered in black moss, and the stained glass windows were so dark they seemed to swallow light. A broken plaque by the entrance read, "St. Michael's Church, Est, 1683. Something about the place felt wrong, but my curiosity got the better of me. I crossed through the rusted gate, its hinges groaning like a warning. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached the heavy wooden doors, which stood slightly ajar. The fog seemed to press against me, thick and unyielding, as though it didn't want me to go further. Inside, the church was colder than outside, and the smell of damp stone filled the air. Rows of broken pews faced a crumbling altar, and the remnants of melted candles were scattered across the floor. But what struck me most were the carvings. Strange symbols were etched into every surface, pentagrams, spirals, and words in a language I didn't recognize. They looked old, older than the church itself. I told myself it was just graffiti, maybe left by thrill-seeking teenagers, but the symbols had an odd precision to them, as if whoever had carved them knew exactly what they were doing. I took a few steps further, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. That's when I noticed the book. It sat open on the altar, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages were covered in writing that looked more like scratches, accompanied by intricate diagrams of circles and sigils. The air around it felt heavy, as if the book itself was radiating some invisible force. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave. But then I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't clear at first, just a soft murmuring like wind through the trees. But as I strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't quite understand. They seemed to come from all around me, bouncing off the cold stone walls. My heart raced as I turned, expecting to see someone there. But the church was empty, or so I thought. In the far corner of the room, the shadows began to shift. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim light, but the darkness seemed to move with purpose. It coalesced into a figure, tall, gaunt, and indistinct, like a silhouette carved from smoke. Its eyes glowed faintly red, and the whispers grew deafening. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but the oppressive energy in the room made it impossible to stay. I turned and bolted, slamming into the heavy doors and bursting back into the foggy night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I turned to look back, the church was gone. The gate, the spire, even the skeletal trees. It was as if the building had never existed. I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but no amount of rationalizing could explain it. The fog had grown thicker, and the road ahead was barely visible. Shaking, I climbed into my car and started the engine. My headlights cut through the mist, but no matter how far I drove, I couldn't seem to escape. The road twisted and turned endlessly, looping back on itself like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Finally, after what felt like hours, the fog began to lift. The air warmed, and the familiar lights of Boston came into view. But the unease didn't leave me. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing whispers in the back of my mind, soft and insistent, like a song I couldn't forget. Even after reaching the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the events of that night. The cold, the fog, the whispers. It all lingered like a bad dream, but what haunted me most was the figure I'd seen. It wasn't just a shadow, it had felt alive, aware of me. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, like I hadn't slept at all. My apartment felt off. It was colder than usual, and a strange smell, damp and metallic, hung in the air. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to go about my day, but little things kept happening that I couldn't explain. First, my phone wouldn't hold a charge, no matter how long I plugged it in. Then, the lights in my apartment started flickering. At one point, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the walls. I tried to ignore it, but as the day went on, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. By mid-afternoon, I was starting to lose it. I decided to do some research to calm my nerves. I typed St. Michael's Church, Salem into Google, hoping to find some history on the place. But nothing came up. No photos, no records, nothing. It was as if the church didn't exist. Frustrated, I expanded my search to local legends and folklore. That's when I stumbled across a forum dedicated to haunted locations in New England. One thread in particular caught my eye: the vanishing Church of Salem. My heart raced as I clicked on it. The post described a nearly identical experience: an old stone church, strange symbols, and a shadowy figure. The comments were filled with similar stories, each one more disturbing than the last. According to the thread, the church was said to appear only under certain conditions: heavy fog, a moonless night, and a traveler who wandered off the beaten path. It was rumored to be a gathering place for occult rituals during the Salem witch trials, a site so cursed that it was erased from official records. But the most chilling part was a warning repeated in almost every comment: if you see the church, do not go inside. Those who do never truly leave. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The whispers, the shadow, the way the church disappeared, all of it lined up too perfectly. I wanted to believe it was a hoax, some elaborate piece of internet fiction, but the memories of that night were too vivid to ignore. As the day turned to evening, the unease in my apartment grew unbearable. The tapping in the walls had turned into scraping, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. I tried turning on every light in the place, but the flickering only made things worse. That's when I noticed something new, faint markings etched into my living room wall. At first I thought they were cracks, but as I got closer, I realized they were symbols, the same ones I'd seen carved into the church. My heart pounded as I traced the shapes with my fingers, a mix of dread and disbelief washing over me. How had they gotten there? And more importantly, what did they mean? Then the whispers started again, faint at first, like they were coming from the far end of a tunnel. But they grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were inside my head. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The words were unintelligible, but their intent was clear. They wanted me to listen. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a dark shadow began to stretch across the floor. It moved unnaturally, twisting and writhing like it was alive. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. The shadow coalesced into a shape, a tall, gaunt figure with glowing red eyes. It didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I felt like I was being watched, judged, by something far beyond my comprehension. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a feeling, an overwhelming sense of dread that filled my mind. "You brought this upon yourself," it seemed to say. "You opened the door, and now it cannot be closed." The figure moved closer, its form barely solid, like smoke trapped in the shape of a person. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight as if the air itself had turned to lead. Its glowing red eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel it, deep in my bones. This thing wasn't just a shadow, it was alive, ancient and malevolent beyond anything I could comprehend. The markings on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the oppressive hum that filled the room. My head throbbed, and my vision blurred as a searing pain shot through my temples. It was as if the symbols were trying to brand themselves into my mind, each glowing line burning its way into my memory. In sheer panic, I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The crash jolted me out of my paralysis, and I bolted for the door. But as I reached for the handle, the figure appeared before me, blocking my path. It didn't move like a person. It simply materialized, as if it had always been there, waiting. Its presence was suffocating, an unbearable weight pressing down on me. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The whispers returned, louder now, a chaotic chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They seemed to be coming from the figure, but also from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I closed my eyes and started muttering under my breath, anything to drown out the sound. Prayers, curses, even song lyrics, I didn't care as long as it gave me something to cling to. But the voices didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to grow stronger, feeding off my fear. Then, without warning, the figure lunged at me. Its form disintegrated into a swirling mass of shadows that engulfed me completely. I felt like I was falling, tumbling through endless darkness, my body weightless and my mind racing. The whispers turned to screams, each one more piercing than the last. My chest burned, and I clawed at my throat, desperate for air. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the shadows receded, leaving me sprawled on the floor of my apartment. The room was dark, the air heavy with the smell of burnt wood and something metallic. My ears rang, and my body ached as if I'd been hit by a truck, but the figure was gone. I sat up slowly, every muscle protesting, and looked around. The glowing symbols on the walls had vanished, leaving only faint scorch marks behind. The oppressive hum was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. My phone buzzed on the floor, its screen lighting up with dozens of missed calls and messages. I grabbed it with trembling hands, relief washing over me as I saw the time. Only a few minutes had passed, though it felt like hours. I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. But nothing else happened. The next morning, I packed a bag and left, unable to stay in that apartment for another second. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the window. But there was nothing, just the empty street and the faint outline of my building disappearing into the distance. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was over. I told myself it was just a terrible dream or a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever I'd encountered in that church hadn't stayed behind. It had followed me, lingering at the edges of my life like a shadow I couldn't shake. I moved into a new apartment on the other side of town, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that night. For a while, things seemed normal. The lights didn't flicker, the air didn't feel heavy, and the walls were mercifully quiet. But the peace didn't last. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, fleeting shadows that disappeared when I turned my head. My dreams were filled with that same oppressive darkness, the whispers returning to haunt me in the dead of night. I began waking up at 3:33 a.m. every morning, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that something was watching me. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I knew I'd locked it before going to bed, I always did. The cold air hit me like a wave, and I felt that same suffocating presence I'd experienced in the church. I didn't dare move, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared into the inky blackness of the hallway. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. But just as I was beginning to think it was my imagination, I heard it. A single, deliberate knock on the wall beside my bed. The knock was followed by a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. I clutched the blankets, frozen in terror, as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening, but deep down, I knew there was no explanation, at least none that would bring me comfort. By morning, the marks were there. 3 long, jagged scratches running the length of my bedroom wall. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and checked into a hotel, desperate to escape whatever had taken hold of my life. But even in the sterile, impersonal safety of a hotel room, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I reached out to the forum where I'd first read about the church, desperate for answers. Most of the responses were sympathetic but unhelpful, filled with vague advice about cleansing rituals and protective charms. One comment, however, stood out. "You can't run from it. The only way to end it is to go back." The idea chilled me to my core. Go back? Back to that church? To the place where it all began? The thought was unbearable, but as the days passed and the terror in my life escalated, I realized I didn't have a choice. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. If I wanted any chance of escaping it, I had to face it head-on. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a crude map of Salem, I set out late one evening, hoping to find the church again. The fog was thick that night, just as it had been before, and the air was bitterly cold. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, the oppressive silence of the road doing little to calm my nerves. When I finally saw the faint outline of the church through the mist, my stomach dropped. It was just as I remembered, ancient, foreboding, and impossibly dark. The gate creaked open as I approached, as if it had been waiting for me. I don't remember much of what happened inside. The details are fragmented, a blur of terror and adrenaline. I remember lighting a candle and reciting a prayer I barely remembered from childhood. I remember the walls seeming to close in around me, the symbols glowing faintly once more. And I remember the shadow, larger and more menacing than ever, descending upon me with a force that took my breath away. When I woke up, I was lying in the grass outside the church, the morning sun breaking through the fog. The church was gone, and the air felt lighter, cleaner, as if whatever had haunted it was finally gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what happened that night, and I'm not sure I ever will, but whatever I did, it worked. The shadows no longer haunt me, the whispers have faded, and my life has returned to something resembling normal. But I'll never forget what I saw in that church, and I'll never take another detour through Salem as long as I live. Have you ever experienced something you can't explain? A moment where the lines between reality and the supernatural blur? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales that will keep you up at night.